Hi, and welcome back to Ask Lattice, the video series where we're going to answer all of your questions that you've given us online and in person.
Today, we're going to be doing a load of questions based around the Crimpd app that we use for many of the people that we train. You'll see behind us that we have a new wall, new location, so a little bit of a change, but same formats, lots of questions from everyone out there on the Facebook community page and the Instagram page.
The number of you downloading the app keeps going up and up, so we want to find out what you want to know more of, if you want any different sessions on there, or if there's anything you don't like so far.
Okay, so let's dive into the questions, and we're going to start with a relatively broad question to start with from Martin Koya. And Martin asks, how do you combine sessions across the week? What's the best combinations of things to add together, basically?
So I'd say that we get this a lot in our premium packages and all of the plans that we work with clients all the time. But I think using the Crimpd app, you get a lot of new type of training that people haven't seen before. So that includes stuff like AeroCap, which is endurance based. You've got Strength and Power, which is bouldering, campusing, and then everything in between. So trying to learn to combine these sessions is quite complicated, but there's a couple of simple rules that you can follow in order to make the most of your time at the wall.
Yeah, it's that combination of intensity with volume that's really key to get right, because often people think, well, this session's moderate intensity and is moderate volume. I can probably combine this with something that's high intensity. And that can often be a mistake, can't it?
Yeah, and I think that if you start getting fatigued during the session and mixing them up, you might start blaming yourself for having a really poor session. And we've done this in the past where you think, oh, I'm just having a bad day, I'm having a bad day. But actually you've just got the stimulus a little bit too close together or the wrong way around, and actually you're doing quite good. It's just that you've got it in the wrong order.
Yeah, so if I was to kind of pick a set of rules and to create a framework behind good combinations of sessions, the first port of call that I would start with is that I would start with the very highest intensity and shortest session. So for example, that might be something like a max fingerboard session, lasts no more than 15 minutes or so for the entire session. And then I combine that with the lowest intensity, high volume session. So something like continuity, really nice, easy session. And that's the two far ends of the spectrum. And that's where I'd start as an athlete that was learning how to combine these sessions. And as you become more experienced and with time, you then start to combine those and bring them closer together. So you could do a high intensity fingerboard session, some bouldering, and then also combine that with slightly harder endurance training. So you can just slowly bring those together. What you don't really ever want to do is have that kind of combo right in the middle, isn't it? Where you're doing everything at mid intensity, mid volume, going for broke, basically.
Yeah, and I think we're probably both quite guilty of this a little bit actually, because if you've not got much time, you try and get too much into a small amount of time of training. So it's really important to sort of spread the stimulus throughout the week. And even though you want to absolutely smash yourself, just think about it a bit more logically, take a step back and try and spread out that session. So you're not doing, like Tom said, all of that mid intensity really close together where it's constantly fatigued thinking, I've got to make the most out of this. Spread it out throughout the week and start with the high intensity and go to low. Another little tip that I'll just add in before we move on is if any of the sessions you find particularly mentally stressful or find hard to get motivation for. So for me, it's longer power endurance, so getting really boxed. I absolutely hate it. So try and spread that out throughout the week and make sure you have a rest day beforehand. So you're going in there feeling ready to go for it and you're absolutely going to smash it. Because what you don't want to do is do it on 2 days on, 3 days on, when you're already feeling quite tired, your skin's hurting, and you kind of just want to go home and eat.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so second question we have here is from Joe B. And they're asking, what's the difference between doing a floor and rings core exercise? So for example, that might be some core tension exercises on the rings versus doing some core tension exercises on the floor. Is there some kind of difference in those two activities?
So I'm guessing he's trying to get to the answer of, is it better to do things that are unstable, like on the rings, or using something like stable positions on the floor where you're not moving around much and the difference between sort of open and closed kinetic chains, which is effectively what I've just described.
Yeah, so I think what we see in terms of the literature and practice for strength and conditioning work is that closed chain exercises, so those where your extremity, so that's your foot or your hand, are staying on a fixed, immovable object like the floor or the wall, those are the most effective for building maximal strength. In contrast, the open chain exercises, such as rings work or TRX, also you can work with strength work, but they're just a little bit more unstable and you may not be able to work the highest level of max intensity. But that's not to say that it has no value, because both you and I do plenty of open and closed chain exercise, and as do our clients. It's just making sure there's a really nice variety and mix of those exercises.
And I think we've both seen over the last few years, there's definitely a lot of things coming out in media where some people will be really, really into the stability and the unstable exercises. They use loads of yoga balls, they use loads of foam rollers, and it kind of looks all a bit new agey and it's tricky. And then you've got the die-hard strength training that like to use sort of barbell work and nice movement patterns which are using large muscle groups. Realistically, like Tom's just said, there's benefits to doing both. Both of them produce different stimulus, so it depends on what time of year you're training. So it's important for you to work out what you're trying to achieve. As a general rule, what I would say is if you're trying to get more stability, then like we said before, use some of the unstable exercises. It can be anything at once. So even down to something like using dumbbells instead of a barbell, just because it's a little bit more unstable. And then if you're trying to build that maximum strength, use something where you're not having to focus on stability quite as much.
Cool. Right, well, next question, and apologies if I don't pronounce this quite right. It's from YBR Kuba, and this individual has asked, which exercises should you do in your training during peak phase? So, in other words, what kind of training exercises would you do if you're in your outdoor season, you're already trying to perform? How do you complement that plus your project climbing?
So what we'll do to begin with, I'll throw in another element of that is, first of all, in what we're peaking for, because we can't really answer that as a general term, I would say, or it'd be easier for us to be a bit more specific. So for you, Tom, then if you're in a route climbing phase and you're trying to do something that's like a longer power endurance climb, what would you do in a peak phase?
So for me, when I'm route climbing, then it's really important to understand that whenever I'm trying my project or getting close to it, I'm doing quite a lot of higher volume work or mid-intensity work. And so therefore the stimulus to that part of my physiology is quite high, even on projecting the route that I'm trying. But what tends to happen is because every move on a route climbing project isn't maximal, I do suffer this kind of de-recruitment process. And over a period of, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks of trying a really hard project, I actually slowly feel weaker and weaker on that project, even though I might be doing quite well on it. So my trick on route climbing is to typically do quite a lot of very, very short, high intensity fingerboarding and bouldering exercises to complement those outdoor sessions. I just keep that power and strength topped up.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly important if you don't get to have the opportunity to go on the project very often. So if you're going out as a weekend warrior, for example, and you're out on the weekends, you need to make sure that you're getting that stimulus in early on in the week, then you've got enough time to rest. So you can go out on your project. But like Tom said, you're not losing anything throughout that process.
Do you do the same with your bouldering projects when you're outside? Do you cut that volume out, or how do you work that out?
I actually do a little bit different. It depends on the type of climbing you're doing on the boulders, because if you're doing a 2 to 3 or even up to sort of 5 to 8 move boulder problem, it's very easy to get sucked into this warming up process and then spending maximum attempts on that boulder. And within a couple of hours, you can only get a certain amount of volume done during that session. So sometimes you end up, yes, you're working at your absolute maximum, but you're not really getting much climbing volume in. So I find it quite important that in the rest of the week, you're trying to get a little bit more volume in. Still at a really high intensity. It's not doing any sort of aerobic power exercises or aerobic capacity. it's about doing some really intense workouts, but with a slightly higher volume. Same thing again, make sure that you're recovering before you go back out for your max efforts. And I think it's even more important, personally, to focus on your skincare afterwards. There's no point going to the crag, trying really sharp, crimpy moves, and then going and doing volume the next 2 days and wearing through your tips.
So I hope you find that useful, and that gives you a few more things to go and work on with that peak and training phase. Okay, next question is from Adrian Montano and asks, is it okay to reduce the rest times during fingerboard training? So this is when you're doing a maximal hang, so you might be doing repeaters of some kind, or you're doing very, very short, very, very intense hangs, is could you reduce potentially those rest times from 2 to 3 minutes, for example, all the way down to 1 minute or less? Would this have some kind of effect on training?
So on the Crimpd app, what we've got so far is we've got interval timers and set rest periods. And that's based on what we found to work best with our athletes and using sort of basic sports science. So looking at the rest periods between different types of stimulus. This is asking effectively whether you can pause those rest periods or even just skip through them so that you can get onto the next set really quickly, and what that change is going to affect. So can you edit what's already set on the Crimpd app?
Yeah, and it's kind of quite a tricky issue to deal with, because in many ways it actually comes down to your training history. So for example, if we take someone who's doing a max hang set and they want to reduce their rest time between their 5-second hangs down to 1 minute, you'll often find in a really well-trained, well-adapted athlete that they can still perform that second, third, fourth rep of 5 seconds at a really high intensity and suffer no loss in performance. So the answer to that individual would be, yes, you can reduce your rest times closer to that minute marker, even though theoretically it might not be okay, and the literature might tell us to address it more at a 2 to 3 minute rest. But if the performance in the individual rep isn't being affected, then you could argue that it would be okay to do that. Whereas often a lot of our kind of mid-level, less experienced climbers who haven't got years and years of training depth, they'll see that if they reduce those rest times between hangs and limit them as too short, the performance in those individual hangs really comes off. And if that's happening, you're not working at your maximal intensity. If you don't work maximal intensity, less improvement.
And then we'll throw in another little element of that is what happens, and I'm guessing, who was it that asked this question?
So this was Adrian.
Adrian. So say Adrian might be asking this because he's trying to fit in all his training and he's just struggling to get it in before the closing time at the gym. So what I would suggest to Adrian in this case, or anyone similar, is yes, you can reduce the rest periods, but you should be reducing the intensity as well slightly. So you might not be operating at your max intensity like Tom said, so you won't be getting the exact same stimulus, but you'll get it in. Or another method, if you're trying to improve finger strength, is just reduce the amount of sets that are completed. So you keep the same rest periods, you keep the intensity as high as possible, but you're including just a few less sets. So you've still got time to fit everything in at the wall. Because at the end of the day, it's better to get it in than worry too much about sticking to the exact times that we've set.
Yeah, really important point there from Ollie is that a lot of people can get really kind of hung up and worried about making small adjustments to their training and then end up not actually completing the training because they don't feel like it's perfect. Often doing something to 75% and doing best possible fit is still effective in your training, as long as you're not doing it every single week, month after month. Okay, so next question is from John Paul, and he's asked, is it possible to have a quality fingerboard session in just 15 to 20 minutes? Is it a waste of time?
So you've probably seen that a lot of the fingerboard sessions that are on the app at the moment are actually quite short. We don't do too many sets or reps, and they're going to be hitting in quite a low limit anyway, low time limit. We found that you can have amazing sessions in just that short period. The difficulty, which I'm not sure if John's included, is does that include the warm-up time? In that case, you can probably still fit in some quality, but the quicker that you rush that warm-up, the higher the risk could be to your fingers, because you're going to be trying to operate close to your maximum without actually being fully prepared to do that.
Yeah, and to further add on from what Ollie said is that if you're only ever doing fingerboard sessions that are really short and intense, the likelihood is that you're going to be choosing some kind of max hang or recruitment style session. And the reality is that if you follow this protocol for months and months and you don't add in some kind of additional stimulus to that fingerboard training, eventually you'll reach a point where you'll have either diminishing returns or you won't achieve overload in your session. If you're not achieving overload, you're not going to make improvements in strength. So that's the harsh reality of it, but you can get away with it for a period.
But if we're looking at 20 minutes for just the actual session, not including the bits on either side, then if we look at sort of 8 sets working towards your maximum and trying to maintain that, or even a bit less, you're still looking under around 20 minutes with a good 2 to 3 minutes rest in between each set. So yes, you can.
Yeah. Okay, last question is from Eva Herbst and asks, how much core can be done in a week and how often do you have to change it up? And we've obviously got some different options within the Crimpd app for different core sessions. How do we generally manage that?
So let's see, like just as a quick question then, Tom, when you were training for Century Crack, and that was a lot of upside down climbing, how often would you do core a week and probably how many hours a week of core were you doing? Because I know Tom was doing quite a lot in this period, so I think this gives you an example of the upper end of what you can get done.
So the approach that I took with my core conditioning when I was working on a project which was very affected by your core strength was that I was training core 7 days a week, and I was doing literally thousands of core movements every single week. And admittedly it was to an extreme, but I came from a background of sports outside of climbing, so I saw what they did. And then I'd also worked with the British diving team for quite some time. And they very much took this approach that if you have a really diverse and varied core conditioning program, this is really effective in building all-round core conditioning strength. And I think it's that all-round aspect, lots of different exercises across intensities and volumes, which becomes particularly effective in building the best or the fittest and the strongest core.
So if you build up over time, you can just do it all the time, 7 days a week, and loads of training. On the other end of the spectrum, if you've got, it's not me, but if you've got a good background, so for myself, having done gymnastics for a number of years as a teenager and working up to a relatively high standard in that, I have a relatively good core strength that's maintained through climbing. So I only do a little bit of core training throughout the week just to maintain that high standard. Yes, I could do more, but my time is probably better spent climbing at the moment. So I only do a very short little amount each week with a little bit of variety. So you need to base it on how you feel.
And to kind of sum up on that core topic, and I kind of feel like sometimes I'm of the extreme end of doing a lot of it, or I did in the past, is I would say for the vast majority of climbers out there, following a regime where you're alternating around perhaps 5 to 10 different exercises and with a high degree of regularity doing it around 2 times a week is a really nice starting point for a generally effective core conditioning program. And I'd advise that would be suitable for many, many climbers out there.
And just try and make sure, focus on form. Even if you do a little bit less volume, it's so easy to be the one that kind of finishes a little bit easier or doesn't extend into the position properly because you're not quite enjoying it. Do a little bit less volume, make sure the form's good, and build up over time.
Okay, well, thanks so much for today. That's got to the end of our questions, and I hope you've enjoyed that and found it informative in terms of how we use and work with the Crimpd app. As ever, if you've enjoyed the video today, please click the like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we also have questions in our Facebook community group and on Instagram, so follow us on there.